I mean, at the moment, the received wisdom is it's not going to go through this week, although it's still pretty close. We're not the votes on next Thursday. I'm in favour of it, and actually one of the reasons why I'm in favour of it is the problem with first past the post is we just stopped talking to anybody who wasn't a Labour voter. And indeed, we didn't really talk to people who were really strong Labour voters. You know, every time you knock on someone's door, because it's all about maximising, turnout. If someone is a strong Tory, you're never going to talk to them again. And actually, if someone's strong Labour, you just put them down in your box and you ring them up on election day, but you never talk to them again halfway, between different election campaigns. So part of the Change to AV campaign is about saying, let's have a system which does at least mean we have to talk to everybody on the electoral register, or at least anybody who might give us their second or third preference. And I think the other thing which is quite interesting, just looking at the UK example, is that I think we did quite a lot of good stuff about getting much better at getting high contact rates. So typically a Labour MP in a marginal, or even in a safe seat, would have a 50 to 70% contact rate of their electorate. But a lot of people decided that wasn't enough, and they've actually combined it with community organising as an electoral approach. So a couple of really interesting constituencies of the last election were Edgbaston and Hodge Hill, both in the Midlands, where Labour did spectacularly badly because the West Midlands was particularly badly affected by jobs leaving that area. And what the two MPs there did was essentially for a while put their political campaigning to a side and do some real grassroots community organising, where what they were doing was finding people who could set up charities or youth clubs or Meals on Wheels projects, and then get those people to come and stand for Labour. So they became kind of your sort of strong rocks in the landscape around which other people could organise, and they became really, really strong advocates, saying, look, I wasn't involved in politics until I met Liam, who was the MP, but then he got me involved. I realised I could set up this youth club, and your kids have been coming, and that became and what that seemed to do was in a time when we were losing lots of votes, it made votes in those constituencies stickier for Labour, because you had people who weren't just Labour politicians making the argument, or who had become Labour politicians, but they'd come from the community.
Claire, if I can just bring you in at this point, how did you do it? I mean, how do you go from a party which can barely form a caucus at points in its 26 years, it barely form a caucus at points in its history, and go to forming a government, and then not only, of course, form a government, but to get re-elected on two further occasions. Do you want to fill us in on some of that? Yeah.
Quickly, because this is kind of a thesis in waiting. Can I just say the question comes from a man who did help us. So one of the things you need are people who believe in you. And when you're a little territory Labor team at the north of the country, there wasn't a lot of kind of belief in that we could do it. So while you're here in publicly, thank you. We had never been in government in all the time of self-government in the territory. We'd never been in government. There was an election before self-government in 1974 where Labor didn't even win a seat. So we came from a very low base. Our trouble was that we had been captured and marginalised, really, in terms of the wider electorate, by issues that we virtually had no control over and that we defended very strongly. I mean, take a uranium mining policy, Land Rights Act, native title, all things that we did support but weren't in our control, and we were very much defined by it. And so when I became leader in 1999, I decided we really had to go mainstream, and we had to be a Labor Party rather than a marginalised party, which we'd become. Although Labor had never won government in the territory strongly supported Labor in federal elections, and there were very strong votes for Labor, and the territory seat was more often Labor than not. So I looked at how we melded the two. That the fact that there was a very strong identity for federal Labor and the issues it stood for, which were clearly about jobs and training, about health, about education, the real fundamentals that we all belong to a Labor Party for, that are traditional values but are also progressive values as well. And we just focused on those. Our big problem in focusing on those was that there was this other very big elephant in the room, and that was mandatory sentencing for property crime. And Labor had tried to sit on the fence with it since it's been introduced in the mid-90s. And sitting on the fence, not only is it a very uncomfortable place to be, but it also, nobody admires you for it. You show no courage and you actually are marked down for it. So we decided in February 1999 to say, off it goes, and we took a very strong stand. What that meant for the next 2.5 years is we had to fight very hard while we're trying to run the positive side of what we were doing in the kind of traditional Labor areas, which were all absolutely vital for the Territory. We had to run a very strong campaign against a policy that was supported in majority all over Australia except Victoria. I don't know why, but except Victoria. So everyone supported mandatory sentencing for property crime. It was really the last issue left when we got to the polls. And for some odd reason, perhaps it's to do, Bruce, with the fact that if you run a strong enough positive agenda, if you look like you've got those issues going to the heart of what people want, then they'll forgive you on one that they still think should stay in place. I think we demonstrated very clearly that mandatory sentencing wasn't working and that we put forward another alternative, but we knew that it still was popular. So election day, much to the surprise of everybody, we won by one seat.
So just to clarify that, would you say that your view about it would be that notwithstanding your policy, you won, or would you say in part it was because of the policy, because it showed a strength in the party that perhaps they hadn't seen before?
I think they thought we were gutsy, maybe didn't agree with us, but at least we had an alternative. And when one of the things about the Territory, when I started in politics in the mid-90s, my electorate was 4,200 voters. By the time I finished, it was 4,800 voters, grown enormously. And you could actually, you knew what people were thinking and you could really connect with them. So, I think they appreciated the fact that we took a strong line. When you went door to door, which is what you do in the Territory, you know everybody's house, everybody's dog, everybody's children, the whole thing. They don't keep crocodiles, Jeff. But you know that, and every second door would say to you when you'd ask, look, what are your issues, what's happening? They'd say, I've been broken into, my neighbour's been broken into, someone I know's been broken into. So we're working with a reality that didn't match the kind of policy people were supporting. So in that, I think we got some gain.
Is it true that you had to have mowed every front lawn in your electorate in order to win the election, or is that just a myth?
Well, we did our renovations at my house based on what I'd seen in other people's houses, because the Territory's great. You knock at somebody's door and they say to you, look, and when you say, what have you been up to? They say, we've done renovations, do you want to have a look? So I'd be wandering through people's bedrooms and en suites and those kind of things. It was a marvellous way to spend your evenings.
Tom, one of the things that you're properly noted for is your 50-state campaign in the United States. For those that haven't heard about it, can you just give a very brief outline of what it was and what motivated you to be doing that at a time when you were going into these states and these electorates, which frankly you probably never thought you had any prospect of turning around to the Democrats?
So the concept of the 50-state strategy came about because in the 2000 and 2004 election, I was involved in the Gore campaign, and the conventional wisdom was the way to win the presidency is you focus on getting to 270, which is an obvious thing. But what you do is you'd calculate about 300, the states, focus on states that would get you to about 305 electoral votes, and then you have a little bit of a margin of error where you could lose some of these. The problem that occurred is all we did is we focused on those states, and the margin of errors of Florida or Ohio became tighter and tighter. And so if things weren't going your way, you had no backup plan. And you were locked into an electoral strategy that in many cases was doomed to fail. And what I mean by that is in 2000, no one, in the early part of 2000, late 1999, no one envisioned Ralph Nader running. And what people forget, and the Republicans did a good job of making conventional wisdom, but they're like, Al Gore couldn't even carry his home state. Well, if you look at that, at the electoral map, you know, the last 2 weeks of the campaign, 10 days of the campaign, Al Gore had to campaign in California, Oregon, Washington State, states that traditionally late in the electoral cycle are already kind of put to bed and you're focusing on the key battleground states. And the same thing happened again in 2004, which was as the Bush campaign was very successful of taking a decorated Vietnam veteran and making national security a liability by voting for that guy. You were suddenly seeing states disappearing off the map that we just had no chance of winning. And the problem is, in order to remain competitive, we continue to spend resources in states that we knew ultimately we would lose. And so by the time we got to 2005, what you could certainly tell was the Republicans no longer had to invest money in hardcore red states. They were able to go into these battleground states that we needed to win. And they were 4 years out, they were already getting prepared for the next election. And so what we knew is we had to take the offensive and change the map. And the only way we could change the map is no longer to rely on winning either Florida or Ohio, in kind of what we used to call as, you know, rolling the snake eyes. And what we decided to do is plant the seed to go out west. We decided to do a couple things. One is to have an active presence in all 50 states, because the one thing we realized was the Democratic Party no longer had a farm team. And what I mean by that is they didn't have a bench to go to, that when we needed to find candidates to run for federal office, there was no state and local candidates that were running anymore because there was no party infrastructure in the states that could sustain their campaigns and help them get elected. And so we were faced with that problem. Two is, what we found is that in order to be effective, you need to have your message out there 24/7. And you can't be airlifted into a state 4 months before the general election, go up to complete strangers and say, trust me, we're going to answer your problems. You know, just, you know, we as the party will do right by you. Because they don't know you. They don't have a relationship. And for the last 3.5 years, all they've heard is the opposition define who you are, what you represent, and everything else. And so what we decided to do is, by being aggressive and being proactive and going to those states and tailoring the needs, not doing a cookie-cutter approach, but we were putting 4 to 5 organizers in every state, applying the new online tools in terms of how to organize and creating a state-of-the-art voter file where you're capturing all this data points and having the conversations year-round, 4 years out, puts you in a much better position of knowing the terrain. So when you're sitting down and making an electoral decision as to how you get to 270, you're doing it from an informed basis, rather than what was happening before is you're doing it on a gut instinct based upon what happened 4 years earlier. And that was kind of the overarching approach of what we needed to do. And had we not done it, you know, the way the primary calendar worked out, and Hillary and Obama go until June without us having a nominee, if we had not done this, we wouldn't have been prepared in the states that we were ultimately successful in.
Bob, John Robertson's now charged with this incredible responsibility to bring the New South Wales party back. Do you want to talk a little bit about your strategies, your tactics, your re-engagement with the electorate 1988 onwards, particularly in those early days when everybody had written the party off for a generation, the next Premier isn't even in Parliament yet, probably hasn't been born. God, where was Rodney Cavalier when we needed him then? What do you think, what were those things that you were doing back then that made the difference?
Well, the thing I started by talking about was laying down markers, a few broad markers. What we said on guns, what we said on forests. That set us up for reclaiming part of the Labor support base that we would need 3 years hence, 7 years hence. The second thing was, by the way, you've got to have fun in opposition. You've got to say, you know, I used to sit there as Minister for Planning and Environment at question time, seeing the RAN and then the Unsworth government being carved up by Greiner and shadow ministers like Yabsley and others. I'm groping for names. And I used to think, gee, to be removed of ministerial responsibility and being able to enjoy destruction for a period would be an exquisite pleasure. And it was one of the reasons I was persuaded to be leader of the opposition. So you've got to be, I was campaigning on the Central Coast once, and I was in a local hall, and I saw a sign warning about the peril of feral animals, exotic infestations, foxes and cats and dogs in the pristine Australian bush. And it said, feral animals are predatory and opportunist. I said, that's written for a state opposition.